digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined once again by Jeff Gomez, who returns to us from Starlight Runner, and we have the lovely Dean Johnson back again from Brandwidth. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hey, Tanya.
Welcome back. So why don't you explain for our lovely listeners exactly who you are and what you're up to? And I'm going to start with you, Jeff.
Hey there. Well, again, I'm Jeff Gomez. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Starlight Runner. That's a production company located in New York City. And we specialize at designing and consulting on story worlds. Those can be anything from big blockbusters, narrative universes like Pirates of the Caribbean or Halo, or they can be brand story worlds like those of Coca-Cola or Pepperidge Farm. And more recently, we've extended our work to geopolitical and sociopolitical causes, using multi-platform narrative to communicate and create dialogue with large numbers of people in the name of social good.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Dean, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you do at Brandwidth, and why don't you also explain exactly what is it, VR48?
Yes. So I'm head of innovation at Brandwidth, and we're these days we call ourselves an innovation agency simply because we've always innovated. You know, we're one of those full service agencies that creates amazing digital content, but big difference these days is that we focus a lot on emerging platforms. So whereas the rest of the business still creates great solutions for things that already exist, I spend a lot of my time hunting out really, really exciting potential within amazing new startups, and we work with kind of the big guns of the world. So combining the two allows us to shape interesting conversation, content, storytelling on all sorts of things that just don't exist yet. So creatively, that's amazing. So my background as a designer, you know, we used to wave our arms around and say, make it bigger, make it red and move it to the left a bit. These days, the scope is enormous. So that is fascinating. So some of those areas that we've covered in the past have been the emergence of interactive books through iBooks, through different devices that then appear. So the iPad emergence, you know, we were there on day one. So all of this kind of insight allows us to do lots of interesting day one launches, but we always try and add value. You know, we don't do this just for the sake of it. Now, you alluded to the VR48 just now. Now, that was with Sarah Jones, part of boundary pushing, if you like, these days, is that we're constantly kind of really testing the hell out of every bit of technology that we find. VR is something that we've worked with at Brandwidth for years. You know, we did our first piece 18 years ago. There's been a whole chunk when it hasn't been relevant in between, but we certainly haven't jumped on any bandwagons when it's now come back to relevance. And what we were seeing was a lot of people that were essentially saying, this is all amazing. And then there were a number of people that were kind of saying, beginning to set endurance records, which was, you know, a couple of years ago, I spent 24 hours in VR, and that was a bit of fun. What we got out of it was a few interesting things. But when we said, Sarah and I, let's spend 48 hours in VR, but let's do it for a reason. It was so that it would be meaningful and have some results from that. You know, some of it was unpleasant. The way we actually structured the 2 days, we try to have the least amount of pain and discomfort and, you know, nausea and everything else that, you know, we knew those kind of things would happen.
I don't know how you're saying that you tried to avoid pain when you've had a tattoo done.
Yes, that's true. I do. Apart from that, we tried to avoid it, but that was there for a very good reason. It was because we wanted to see if VR could mitigate pain, that level of distraction, and to a certain extent that worked. But what we then did in amongst that lot was to do a lot of physical activity. And took those things to extremes.
Hold on a second. Let's define physical activity, because wing walking on a plane, I don't know if that counts as physical activity or ridiculously. I don't know, but that's definitely taking it to the extreme.
Yeah, I mean, it could have got very physical if we'd fallen off the wing. But the next steps from that lot is really that because of those 48 hours, you know, we immersed ourselves as much as we could. So that was using a variety of different headsets, that was using the controllers that went with it, and say we were as physical as we could be. But what's actually become something that's really fallen out of that is I'm now developing an immersion suit that works for AR and VR, and this is using like a full body haptic suit that uses electrocution, which sounds like I'm going for the world of pain again here.
This is not sounding good.
It's very light level. So whereas we thought of haptics as being kind of things that vibrated and kind of the gaming world, this is actually putting electrical impulses directly to the muscles and stimulating that. So when you're in a virtual or a augmented environment, you feel the things you see. But this is really kind of developing onto, how do you then bring that to an audience? And so this becomes part of our storytelling, essentially. It's not necessarily about what goes on the platforms, but how do we then tell to an audience the benefits and the technicality of a lot of these pieces of equipment that are turning up now without it just sounding dry and yet another PowerPoint show. So there's a bit of theatre involved, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you for that explanation. That's very thorough. But what I wanted to talk about today, because I am very aware of just how much expertise we have in this conversation right now when it comes to narrative and storytelling. And I say this on the basis of, certainly in my humble opinion, Jeff is one of the, I'm going to say, grandfathers of transmedia storytelling and ARG storytelling for that matter. And I find it quite interesting in that we seem to be in a current cultural era where there is an issue with minutia of echo chambers, especially when it comes to social media. And the types of narrative that we're hearing, the types of stories that we're hearing are very much within a very small bubble of influence that we keep on kind of forgetting that it isn't actually representative of the wider world. And I wanted to kind of initially start off with you, Jeff, just because I know that you're doing some interesting work in this particular arena. But I want to understand from your perspective what we're seeing happening when it comes to these very, very small micro echo chambers that people are consciously or unconsciously finding themselves being narrowed into. What's your take on this?
Sure, Tanya. Actually, it's both. It's amazing. It's unprecedented. It's a little bit scary, but it is remarkable, and it is an indicator of permanent and lasting change in the world. I feel that we've been looking very, very closely at this at Starlight Runner because, of course, the whole basis for our particular brand of production is the fact that story, we recognized, was becoming porous. Porous, meaning that we are moving out of a broadcast model where a very few and very elite are essentially defining reality for a vast amount of people. Now, people have voices. So stories being told, whether they're being told by our government, whether they're being told by big corporations or even by entertainment companies, are becoming participative because we can comment on these stories. We have the capability, even a very few of us combined, can alter the behavior of these storytellers or alter the course of human history in a matter of moments. So I think what it all boils down to is the fact that the game's changed. Until the late 1990s, we really had the only personal power, the only self-determination that we had as an audience or as consumers, as citizens, was our vote. Are we going to watch the TV show or not? Are we going to purchase the detergent brand or not? Are we going to vote for this person or that person? Now we can form tribes not within the walls of our homes or even in the neighborhood surrounding our homes. We can crisscross across time and space to form tribes that have a common sense of self-determination, and that can have incredible impact, an unpredictable impact in society. So this is an elaborate way of saying that we are coming to feel our own sense of power, Tanya, and in some ways it's amazing because we're forming these kind of weird self-organized social systems that can change the way that sexual harassment is perceived. And we can actually diminish that horrible thing in our society. but it also allows us to organize terrorist cells around the world that don't even have leaders. And that could be very, very dangerous as well.
Okay, so here's the thing, Dean. I'm throwing this back over the fence to you now, which is I think that we're in a very interesting point in history, which is to say, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again, which is that never in the history of mankind have there been so many screens to each individual person on the face of the earth. So the average human being has 6 screens in their lives: their mobile phone, their tablet, their TV, their laptop or computer, their cinema screen, or any advertising screens they might happen to interact with. So they have quite a lot of technology in their lives. And in fact, when we look at things like, for example, a smartphone, and sure, we're talking about, kind of first world and kind of reasonably wealthy cultures here, but most people will have access to their own personal phone, be that a smartphone or some form of portable device. And as a result, we have this relationship with technology that, again, there are some people who don't like this phraseology, but that we have a learned helplessness on this technology, in as much as we've become so dependent on having the features and the functionality of that device in our pocket or in our hand that we don't understand how to function without it anymore, or we actually have an emotional attachment to what is essentially a piece of technology. So with the smartphone, there is an argument to say that isn't necessarily that you have an emotional attachment to the smartphone itself, but that you have an emotional attachment to the data that you put within the phone. But either which way, if you were to say to the average person, give me your mobile phone, unlock it, and let some random stranger rummage around in your phone, most people are going to feel a little bit personally violated. They may even feel a little bit of stress and anxiousness when they hand over that device. And even more so when you say to somebody, I'm going to take your device away from you for, a month. Some people would literally panic. They would be lost because they utilize that phone in so many different ways that it's become a standard normal part of their life. And so my question to you, Dean, is that in the context of this dependency, this reliance that we have on technology in our lives now, where we see this boundary, this kind of balance, if you like, between our social tribes that Jeff was talking about and the use and the application of the technology in order to facilitate those social tribes, whether or not perhaps there is a danger that we have become too reliant on the technology to facilitate our communication with other people. I mean, you don't have to look much further than the dinner table and watch everybody sitting there texting each other rather than actually talking to the people around the table. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one, Dean.
Oh, sorry, hang on. I was on my phone. No. But seriously, I think my answer to that, I've got kind of 2 answers here. The first one is with my kids. They are in so many areas now. They have always been my sounding board for testing technology, for throwing all sorts of weird and wonderful things at them way before most other people ever get to. And they will give you a fast and honest opinion on whether something is good, bad, ugly, whether it fits into their lives or what it needs to be in order to work, acceptably with them and how they live. Now, as parents, responsibly, our parents told us, get your nose away from the TV screen, you'll go blind. They told us other things would make us go blind as well. That didn't. Now, they also said, technology doesn't really work. It doesn't fit in with what you do. So what we need to be doing is taking a step back and saying, right, now the easy answer is to say, just take it away, ration this. But I think, personally, I feel that the generations that are coming to technology now, that are living with it now, they need to master it. They don't need to be what you're describing very succinctly there, Tanya, is we're almost becoming slaves to that technology. But by mastering that technology, it's not about knowing when to put it down. It's just knowing how to genuinely multitask, knowing how to coexist with all of that information we're constantly bombarded by, and mentally filtering it out, because that technology is only going to go away if you physically put it down. And as soon as you do that, as you say, we get those withdrawal symptoms rather that kick in. And that's not really because we just haven't got the phone. It's because we haven't got access to what is on the phone. So, I know we're closer to it than average Joe on the street, but, we're constantly taking in all sorts of information, and that is great. But let's say we need to learn how to filter. Now, one of the big problems, obviously, that we face there is, as you were kind of saying there, Jeff, you were talking about, government information and things that we talk about and we refer to now, obviously, as fake news. That kind of thing has always been around, as far as propaganda or editorial opinion. But I was explaining to my eldest daughter the other week about Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast and how that was,
Yes.
that was an entire nation that were listening to a radio taking in that they were being attacked by aliens. That essentially was fake news, but what it was incredibly creative storytelling.
Indeed.
That we would kind of take a step back from now, because we wouldn't just give people on a national broadcast something that appeared to be news. Of course that's what's happening, but there are incredible opportunities there for us to genuinely shape. Now, we work with clients, I won't say who want to really make some impact with a brand. They want to get something out there into the outside world. Well, you need to creatively tell a story, which may be a little bit, not bending the truth, might be actually reshaping the truth, is probably a more diplomatic way of saying that. But it means that you are having more impact in the right place at the right time by saying certain things that is not, it's not untrue. It may be something that you're aiming for and you're able to deliver by the time something launches, but it's a certain way of, essentially that is tapping into the fake news part. Now, so yes, answering the question, are we too dependent on it? Yes, we are, but we need to master that rather than, the answer is not to simply put it down, unfortunately.
It's interesting that you say this, in as much as one of the things that I found quite interesting was a conversation that I had a little while ago with somebody where we were talking about this, the other person said it was a problem. And my stance on it was, it's not really a problem so much as a reframing of the mind and the approach to things, which was that there's this YouTube thing where young people are confronted with different types of technology or different challenges or questions and asked to explain what this thing is. And, they can sometimes be a bit unsure because things are a bit before their time, the older technology that, they're not used to it, or they don't know necessarily that piece of information right on hand. And the kind of summary of the conversation with this person was that we live in an age where the younger generation don't understand the concept of knowing an answer for themselves. Instead, they know how to Google it. And it's a whole lexicon of the fact that Google it is actually an acceptable phrase in the dictionary. But that idea that they know how to search for the information. And this person that I was speaking to was like, this is terrible. Young people don't even know how to, understand this information for themselves and learn it. And, in my day, it was by rote, and you learnt the things and you knew it and it was in your brain. And it's like, that's great. But perhaps what we're missing here is the fact that we have shifted in terms of culture, and we have shifted in terms of technology, whereby we don't all need this information in our heads. And perhaps it's not the right way to educate young people to drill lots and lots of information into their head that, frankly, most of us never use that information once we've left school. And in fact, knowing how to effectively search for information and how to effectively identify the relevant route to information is perhaps a better use of the time that a young person has, or any person has, in terms of reshaping the thought path to get to the information. And I'm curious to kind of understand what your stance would be on that. In fact, I'm going to throw this at both of you, but I'll start with you, Jeff.
Well, I agree with Dean in the sense that, we're doing what we do all over the world. And I've heard a lot of negativity thrown at mobile phones, particularly with regard to youth. And, they're obsessed with the phones, and there is a degree of truth in the fact that we're seeing a kind of global rise in anxiety among youth, and that some of that is rooted in this kind of dissonance where the mobile phone is both the source of aspiration and self-efficacy, but also of anxiety, because you're kind of being judged 24 hours a day, or you're drawing comparisons between yourself and your peers or yourself and celebrities and so forth around the clock. So even I acknowledge that there is some dissonance here, but Dean is right in that we've got to move past that. Mobile phones are a method of dialogue. They're a method of research. They're a method of self-expression, social interaction. When you really start to understand how to use your mobile phone, when you become literate at it and reframe your mind, as you say, Tanya, you can use this thing as a method of amplification. You become a broadcaster yourself. It becomes a method of self-determination. It becomes a method of change making. All of this is not terribly possible without media literacy. Our education systems have fallen behind. This technology is not being taught in school where it needs to be taught in school from the grade school level, I say. And a whole classification of education, media literacy, needs to be strongly considered, or this could progress and get worse for us.
Dean, what's your thoughts on this in terms of that kind of idea that perhaps the next generation are thinking in a completely different way in terms of their attitude towards information and the use and application of technology to acquire or to access information?
So I'd take this back to how I work with design teams. So my background as a designer, I started as a designer before we had access to Google. That makes me sound really old. But I can't even really think back to a time without Google. But the thing is, research began randomly, or we were able to randomly research, put it that way. So my example would always be, if you're at the very start of a project and you have been asked to answer a brief, and the first thing that you do is not to go and see what someone else has done. Now, that's what Google does very well. So if you put in, I always witness design teams going, right, what someone else designed, cars, books, tables, whatever else. And of course, the results are somebody else's designs. So your starting point is almost your finish point, of course, for somebody else. Now, if you ask a design team to walk into a bricks and mortar library and you say, what I want you to do is go and take the first book off the first shelf that you get to, and that becomes your starting point. So, it may be a research project that requires you to rebrand an airline, and the first thing you pick up is something on horse riding. But if you just say, right, now I just want this to be your first point of contact with anything visual and your first reference. And if you had put into Google airline branding, of course the answers would have all been branded airlines. It might have been branding through the ages, and you may have had some incredible historical reference to say how we're going to then take it on to the future. But what it wouldn't have done is give you those kind of random results. Now, what it wouldn't have done would give you those results initially. But what Google is very good at is allowing you to fall down the rabbit hole and discover all sorts of weird and wonderful things, not always wonderful, but all sorts of things that you would never have stumbled across. So it kind of needs to be that we push further than we think the end point is with a piece of research on Google. Don't worry about getting lost, because it's a bit like then we begin to start to fall back into that randomness of the library, because don't think that Google comes up with the best answers. It comes up with the top answers that have been manipulated for all sorts of reasons. And then some of those are good just because someone has actually got the right metadata behind it. But keep going. So, keep pursuing the answer that you shouldn't settle for what you first find. You should feel as if there is way more, as we know there is way more depth to the internet. Clearly, we're not expecting you to find everything, but it's just, really don't settle. And I think that's probably one of the worst things that we do these days. And simply because of the convenience of just Googling, if it comes up with what appears to be the right answer, we will accept that as the right answer. And particularly for research and, any kind of development beyond what is just a simple response, you need to go way, way deeper, even if it does go off on some weird and wonderful tangents, because they deliver the things that you weren't expecting. And say Google top level delivers the things you were expecting. And, one of the great joys in life is discovering something new every day. And Google isn't very good at delivering that.
This is indeed true. But one of the things that I find quite interesting is that you are both parents and you have children of a reasonably teenagey kind of area. So you both know what it's like to deal with teenagers. So I'm going to kind of throw this one out there because I think that there is this natural, interesting question where young people at this kind of point in time have become very adept at the idea of personal narrative curation. And I say this on the basis of if you've ever watched a teenager, Instagramming or Snapchatting or whatever they're just taking the selfie for, the amount of detail and attention that goes into that personal curation of who they want to represent that they are to the world is actually incredibly detailed. And in many ways, I think that it is one of those cultural lessons that teenagers have learned that hasn't been something that's necessarily been taught in a school or a formal academic institution. But it is this thing that has become a natural skill for young people to understand the importance of personal narrative. And I'm curious from your perspective as parents and as individuals who work professionally within this kind of landscape, what your take on that is. And I'm going to start with you, Jeff, because I know that you have a by the way, beautiful young daughter, but she has a very clear eye on her articulation of herself in the images that she chooses to share. And I remember seeing a Facebook post where there was apparently quite a lot of negotiation that occurred between you and your daughter before the photo was allowed to be published as such. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective on this.
It's absolutely fascinating, and you're right. I get a lot of my theory, at least it's sparked by observation of my daughter's use of social media, but also her peers and those younger and older than her. Again, this is, to me, absolutely fascinating because for all of human existence, we've always played roles in our waking lives. We behave differently toward different people or different types of people in our lives, and that's been clearly established. Now, what's happened is, you can play the role of the daughter of Jeff Gomez to Jeff Gomez for a little while. But then you walk away and that role is done. You can move on to a different role because Jeff's not in the room anymore. What's fascinating to me is that in the social media space, you are developing and creating roles that persist, that actually have to stay that way and be that way 24 hours a day for as long as the handle exists on that social media platform. That's really interesting because there are now multiple yous, one on Instagram, one on Facebook, one on Xbox Live, one on LinkedIn, and one on Snapchat, and they each are slightly different. And that's what I have been observing in Evangelia's online persona. Her public Instagram is different from her Finsta, which is apparently an Instagram that I am not allowed to have any access to. And those two are different from what she does on Facebook, which actually is very little, and on any number of other social media platforms, some of which I may not even be aware of. But and by the way, each of those personae, which are crafted and fully formed, deal with a slightly different and perhaps entirely different community. So when something big happens in Evangelia's life, she is actually capable of communicating it in different ways across different media platforms, amplifying the result of what it is, the effect that she's trying to achieve in that communication exponentially. This is really important. And we call this, by the way, it's a technical word, but we call it superpositioning. Okay? So superpositioning is the fact that in addition to all the roles you play in your ordinary life, there are multiple persistent personae, projections of yourself across different social media that are active 24 hours a day that you have to be mindful of, especially if you're young. 24 hours a day that you cultivate, that you craft, that you feel anxious about when you're away from them, right? You can be wondering how people are responding to the post that you gave overnight. You could lose sleep over it. No wonder young people are getting more and more anxious. But that's really, really powerful and needs to be examined and needs to be taught because it's also the source of these remarkable mass behavioral waves that we are seeing across the world. People are superpositioning themselves into movements, and these movements are impacting the course of human history.
Well, Dean, how do you follow that?
Well, I kind of follow it in a slightly different way because my two daughters are 8 and 12, and we haven't quite reached peak social media yet. They essentially know all the stuff that I do, but Hattie, 8, she certainly hasn't got anything, and Olivia just desperately wants everything. So she's not. I mean, we've been really strict over the kind of the age limiting, and poor Olivia feels left out because basically all her friends at school just put in fake ages on everything, so they're on every network way before they should do. But we've been. So it excites me and terrifies me in equal measures, as do most things in the world. But it means that I know the great potential for it, and I live and breathe the stuff. So I can't say don't do that. As you mentioned earlier, I got a tattoo. I now can't say to my daughters don't get a tattoo. Foolishly. But the thing is, I know the real pitfalls to all of this, and what you mentioned there, Jeff, about the maintaining that persona. Again, it comes a little bit back down to how well everyone copes with the technology itself, and how that becomes part of their lives. When I know how all consuming it can be for us when it's what we do, and I will observe initially, and then interesting to see how I feel as if I need to step in and give more advice as to how the time needs to be best managed. But both of the girls have been. Because they've lived with the stuff that I've done for years, they're so fascinated by it all, and they already make stuff, and they've already featured in so many things that I've already done. So they've kind of been in it from the other side of the camera, as if they were podcasting, as if they were vlogging, as if they were doing anything on almost any channel, but on my channels. So they are used to the experience of being out there, so that familiarity is brilliant, but also that kind of confidence building is really, really interesting. And they've both gone through phases where it's a bit like they've kind of shied away, going, "Oh, I don't really want to be in something." But I think it's more about what they had a better offer of doing something else at the time. But the thing that will be fascinating to me is to see how that flips over when it's their channel, because they're not going to say no to themselves. And as you say, Jeff, it's that persistence, that knowing that once they have posted something. What is it that their audience, however big or small or however personal that is, how are they responding? And if it's my audience, they never really see the result of that again. They just know that the thing that they've seen once and then appears when I may show someone else, that's fine and it's forgotten and they've moved on. But when it becomes their own content and there's their own ownership of that, that's a very different animal. And one that I say I'm excited and desperately worried about in equal measures. But yes, so mine's a very different answer because I'm not quite living it yet. Maybe from the other side of the camera, but I'm not quite living it from their perspective.
But one thing I do think is quite interesting, and I'm saying this on the basis of you're at that cusp, Dean. Your children haven't quite got there yet, but they're going to reasonably soon. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting is, for example, we've recently been hearing a lot in the kind of certainly the UK news, and I'm sure in the US that there's probably been some comment about it too, which is that the mental health of young people is at possibly even a crisis point at this stage, in as much as there are so many young people who are in need of access to mental health expertise. Because of the nature of the lives that they lead, and the nature of the culture and society that they live within. And part of the contributing factor to that is their social personas, this superpositioning, as Jeff mentioned, which is that if something happens to that positioning, if something happens to their persona that is perceived by them as damaging, it has a deep psychological impact on them. And we've seen cases of suicide in some cases, but certainly depression in many cases, where young people might feel that their social identities have been in some way damaged. And we hear that, the increase of things like, digital bullying, for example. And as adults, and there are some people as adults who will just kind of sit there and kind of go, well, it's just social. We just turn off the device, just stop looking at it. But for a young person, as Jeff kind of pointed out, it's one of those things that they're constantly thinking about it. They're constantly worrying about how is their audience responding to whatever they posted or whatever the event was that they told people about, or whatever that thing was. And so it is quite difficult to separate now this idea of just physically stepping away from the technology or stepping away from the social media to the actual psychological impact that has on their lives. And I'm curious, Jeff, from your perspective, in terms of the work that you've been doing, whether or not psychological impact and mental health has been a part of that context.
100%, Tanya. And what's often frustrating to me is the notion of cutting things off is always the initial go-to. Oh, stop using it. It's not going to, and so forth. And by the way, it's a real concern, because the first people that get that message, stop it, stop using that, put it down, you can't have it, I'm not going to buy it for you until you're a teenager, are girls. Are girls. They're perceived to be more in danger. They're perceived to be victims or potential victims of this technology, and I think that's unfortunate, because it is an element of old society kind of reinforcing itself. What we have been advocating, and what we actually have been putting into our activations, is an effort to get people to understand language ontologically, and story, how to structure story, how to tell story. These are sense-making skills, an understanding of language and story that maintains personal integrity and psychological health. It's the skill of assembling and rearranging data, facts, other people's stories, into a unique and constructive personal interpretation of the world. It teaches you how to not take things so personally. It teaches you to understand that other people's language and other people's stories are their own, and don't have a direct effect necessarily on you, because it's just language. It's just how they perceive things. And believe me, they're more worried about themselves than they are about you. Tanya, the media is aghast at how so many fail to understand the media. It's time for the media to teach people how to interpret the media. If the media keeps on shaming people for not understanding how certain populist leaders are manipulating them or are lying to them and so forth, then these people think that they're being told that they're dumb. And this perpetuates resentment and polarization and so forth. What I think we really need to do is make sure that people understand how language is used, and how language can be used to get people to think things that aren't necessarily in their best interest. This goes for teenagers who are messing with mobile phones, but it also goes toward your nation and mine.
Yes, it certainly does. But what I will say is that there is obviously a lot that needs further exploration and needs to continue to be allowed the room and the scope for growth and evolution. But what I'm curious to understand from each of you is, what is that one thing that you think needs to happen? Be that a social thing, cultural thing, a technological thing, that can help to reframe people's attitude towards the application of technology and personal narrative. And I'm going to start with you, Jeff, because you've been on the show more times than Dean.
Well, I think the number one thing that I would recommend, and that we are prescribing and using, and not just testing in the field right now, but proving in the field right now, is that the standard narrative model is no longer serving us. Okay, so when you think of the standard narrative model, you think essentially of the hero's journey. The fact that, one of us, who is usually white and male, has to rise up to meet a certain challenge, journey out into the world and do battle with dark forces.
Whilst acquiring sidekicks along the way, don't forget that.
The sidekicks along the way, and grab the boon, the treasure that will save us all. And he comes back and everything is great for everyone. And he just kind of walks off into the sunset. That's not working anymore. It imposes its rightness on us when we are beginning to see that maybe not everything about that hero's journey was a good idea. Particularly its violence, its aggression, its penchant for conflict, because conflict was what amused our primitive brains. So instead, we are advocating a kind of collective journey model, and we're teaching this. And this is an observation, essentially, that story has become nonlinear. It has become participative for the first time since, in centuries. It is becoming a vessel for diverse characters and diverse perspectives. And this is really powerful, because it helps us to alter, not just to defeat the villain or kill the bad guy, but to heal entire systems, to fix complicated problems. We have that capability. We're watching it happen right now. So that's, for me, the number one endeavor in my life and in Starlight Runner's work, to try and convey to people the fact that story has fundamentally changed.
Okay. Dean, what's your take on this in terms of what do you think is that one thing that can influence or impact the way that people perceive both the technology but also the evolution of personal narrative?
Okay, in a word, and then I'll give you a bunch of other words. Relevance.
Okay.
So we will often be involved in selling in new technology as it's the great savior and it's the advancement of communication and storytelling, and it's what everyone naturally is going to evolve onto using. Now, this has come at us in several ways in the past. So, for instance, the enhanced reading experiences we were involved in the Numinous Place a few years ago, which was a phenomenal experiment of bringing fictional writing to life, where you had the backing of Russell Crowe, and it was written by a Hollywood screenwriter, Mark Stauffer, and it was back to the hilt with all sorts of things that had great creative potential, but the audience was not there. Because we either enhanced things so much that we were taking either kind of gamifying things to a point where people that wanted to just play a game didn't want to read anything, or we took it away from being a book, and actually the people that wanted to read a book just wanted to read a book. And what it did, it still, it was still incredible merits, but it wasn't relevant to a big enough audience for it to live in its shape and form. Now, it's one of these things, it's a bit like VR and AR at the moment. VR in particular is a tough one, because everyone's going, oh, VR is kind of what's next, because that's failed. It hasn't failed at all in so many areas where it's relevant. So for education and training and design and the areas where it's
healthcare.
Tattoo pain relief. And you take it away from those environments, and like we were talking about taking your phone away earlier, people will notice, and if not just notice, they will. It will hinder what they are doing because it is genuinely adding some value. Now, you take it away from actually the things that are making the headlines, which is like it's the future of filmmaking, it's the future of gaming. You take it away from those environments right now, and the audience is still small enough for them to just kind of go, yeah, it's fine. What else we got? So we haven't made it relevant to those audiences because it just doesn't fit in with what they do. So that it's a little bit like we were talking about social just now. Now, those kind of social conversations that happen, it's exactly like the approach from parents and I guess teachers and within education. It's a little bit like social is something that happens to somebody else because we are in that weird, and I often refer to the uncomfortable middle ground. It's where we are, I guess, in a slightly generational thing where if you're not a parent that uses social media and uses it to the extent that we do, or you're not a teacher that uses it to that level, then it's something that happens to somebody else. Now, you hear all bad stories and the potential, you hear very few good stories about it because it's, it is what it is. But you don't then relate to the problems. So again, it's that level of relevance. If it's not relevant to a parent and it's not relevant to a teacher, then it's all too easy to dismiss. And now if we want things to stick, we don't want them to be easily dismissible. So, it doesn't, the tough thing is, particularly with hardware and platforms, the people that make these things don't do a good enough job of telling people why they're relevant. They just tell them they exist and expect people to buy them. And once they've bought them, they then expect somebody else to tell them all the amazing things that they can then put on them and do with them. But the tough thing is really it kind of gets left to the people that make, great creative content to express to the outside world why it's relevant. When actually we're the ones that haven't got the massive budgets. The guys that, the Samsungs and the Apples of the world that made all this kit in the first place, they're the ones, the pressure is on them to tell people why it's relevant, not to just make it. And I'm the first one to say, no, the audience doesn't know what it wants. Let's just make something. But if you're just going to make something, you've still got to tell the story as to why it fits into someone's life.
I find this really interesting in as much as, what you're talking about there with that project where it wasn't quite a book and it wasn't quite a game. And because of that, it kind of it was nothing to anybody, but it was trying to be something to everybody. And in a way, I think with VR and AR technology, it's kind of a similar thing in as much as we are failing to take the audience on the journey with us to get them to a point where they understand the reasoning for why the technology is relevant to their lives. And that, I think, is the missing component, is the fact that we aren't taking them on a journey. We're just putting the technology in front of them. And I think you're totally right in that. But gentlemen, as always, we like to ask you to share with us a social media handle of choice so that our lovely listeners can find out a little bit more about what you're up to. What would that be, Jeff?
Well, you can reach me through Twitter at Jeff_Gomez. That's at Jeff, Jeff _. Please include the underscore because the other Jeff Gomez gets really pissed off. Jeff _Gomez, Gomez.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Dean, what about your good stuff?
And I'm Active Right Brain on Twitter. So that's ActivRightBrain without the E in the middle, simply because I had too many characters in the end.
Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. digitaljamsessions.com